Across the Australian outback, a fence stretches across the landscape for thousands of kilometres. It crosses deserts, dry plains, and some of the most remote country on Earth. For generations, people have repaired it, governments continue to fund it, patrol teams still inspect it. Yet this fence was never built to divide nations. It was built to divide something else. For more than a century, it has marked the boundary between Australia's sheep country and the wild country beyond. But why would an entire nation decide to build one of the world's longest fences? The answer is not simply about dingoes or sheep. It is the story of how Australia built one of the world's largest pastoral economies, how the outback fought back, and how one decision reshaped the Australian landscape in ways that are still being debated today. To understand why this fence exists, we have to return to a very different Australia. To understand why Australia built one of the world's longest fences, you first have to understand the Australia it was built to protect. During the 19th century, the continent was changing rapidly. European settlement expanded beyond the coast, pushing deeper into the interior in search of new grazing land. Vast pastoral stations spread across the landscape as merino sheep became the foundation of a growing wool industry. Before long, wool had become one of Australia's most valuable exports, driving economic growth and linking the young colony to markets on the other side of the world. Across the inland, new homesteads appeared, wells were dug, stock routes crossed the plains, railways gradually connected remote pastoral districts to distant ports. The Australian interior was no longer simply a frontier, it was becoming one of the country's most important economic landscapes. But this transformation brought an unexpected challenge. Long before the first sheep arrived, mainland Australia was already home to its largest terrestrial predator. For thousands of years, dingoes had adapted to the continent's harsh climate, occupying landscapes that were now being transformed by pastoral expansion. As sheep stations pushed further into the interior, the two increasingly shared the same country. At first, many believed the conflict could be managed. Few imagined it would eventually lead Australia to undertake one of the largest fencing projects in its history. By the late 19th century, the conflict had become impossible to ignore. Across Australia's expanding sheep country, graziers searched for ways to protect their flocks. Shepherds, traps, poison, bounties, and local fences were all tried. Some worked for a time, none solved the problem. So how did Australia arrive at a decision unlike anything attempted before? Why did a nation facing one of nature's oldest predators choose to build one of the world's longest fences, and after more than a century? And did that decision achieve what it was meant to? To answer those questions, we have to return to the decades when Australia's wool boom collided with the realities of the outback. By the middle of the 19th century, Australia was changing at an extraordinary pace. Across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and South Australia, vast pastoral stations pushed further into the interior. Every year, more sheep grazed across the plains, and more wool left Australian ports bound for textile mills on the other side of the world. What had begun as a colonial industry was becoming one of the foundations of the Australian economy. The expansion seemed unstoppable. As new grazing land was claimed, remote homesteads appeared where only scattered camps had existed before. Wells were dug, fences stretched across open country, stock routes connected distant properties, and railways gradually linked the inland to coastal ports. For many settlers, the outback represented opportunity. For governments, it represented prosperity. But the landscape had not been empty before the sheep arrived. For thousands of years, dingoes had lived across much of mainland Australia, hunting native animals and adapting to some of the harshest environments on Earth. Now, a new food source had appeared. As sheep stations expanded deeper into dingo country, attacks on livestock became increasingly common. For individual graziers, the loss of even a small part of a flock could threaten an entire season's income. As the wool industry continued to grow, so did the pressure to protect it. What began as a local problem on isolated stations was slowly becoming a challenge that governments could no longer ignore. As sheep stations expanded across the Australian interior, graziers searched for ways to protect their flocks. The earliest solution was simple. Shepherds remained with the sheep throughout the day, watching for predators and driving dingoes away before attacks could occur. For a time, the system worked, but as properties grew larger and flocks spread across increasingly remote country. Employing enough shepherds became expensive and impractical. Landholders began looking for other solutions. Many turned to fencing. Wire fences divided vast paddocks across the outback, reducing the need for constant supervision. But while they helped manage livestock, they offered little protection against determined predators. Dingoes found gaps, slipped beneath damaged sections, or crossed through weak points that stretched for kilometers across isolated country. Governments introduced bounty schemes, offering payments for every dingo destroyed. Poisoning campaigns followed. Traps were set across pastoral districts. Each measure reduced losses in some places. None provided a lasting solution. Wild dogs continued to move across the landscape, often crossing from neighbouring properties where control efforts were less effective. A station could invest heavily in protecting its own sheep, yet remain vulnerable because the surrounding country remained exposed. The problem was no longer confined to individual graziers. It had become regional. As losses continued, neighbouring landholders began working together, constructing longer stretches of dog-proof fencing around entire districts. It was an important step forward, but even these larger systems had limitations. A single damaged section, an unfenced boundary, or one poorly maintained district could allow wild dogs back into sheep country. Decade after decade, the same conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. Local solutions could reduce the threat, but they could not solve it. By the early 20th century, one reality had become increasingly difficult to ignore. The challenge was no longer how to protect a single flock, or even a single station. It was how to protect an entire pastoral region. Across South Australia, neighbouring graziers had already begun working together, constructing longer stretches of dog-proof fencing around their properties. Local vermin districts coordinated maintenance, shared costs, and attempted to keep wild dogs out of valuable sheep country. But the system had a fundamental weakness. It only worked if every section was maintained. One damaged fence, one neglected boundary, or one poorly maintained district could allow wild dogs to return to areas that had spent years keeping them out. The barrier was only as strong as its weakest point. As Australia's wool industry continued to expand, governments reached an increasingly difficult conclusion. The existing system was no longer enough. Instead of hundreds of disconnected fences managed by separate districts, Australia needed a coordinated barrier designed to protect its most important sheep-producing regions. That decision changed the scale of the challenge completely. Protecting sheep country would no longer rest solely with individual landholders. It would become a coordinated government responsibility, supported by legislation, dedicated inspectors, and permanent maintenance. The creation of the Dog Fence Board marked the beginning of that new approach. Over time, existing sections of fencing were linked, strengthened, and progressively realigned into the continuous barrier that still stretches across the Australian outback today. It became one of the largest and longest-running infrastructure projects ever undertaken to protect Australia's pastoral economy. But building the fence solved only one part of the problem. Keeping it standing would become the next great challenge. Building the dog fence was an extraordinary achievement. Keeping it standing was something else entirely. A barrier stretching for thousands of kilometres could never simply be left alone. Floods washed away sections of fencing. Feral camels damaged remote stretches. Storms weakened posts and buried wire beneath drifting sand. The Australian outback continually tested what people had built, so a different kind of work began. Inspectors travelled the fence line, first on horseback and by camel, through some of the most isolated country in Australia. Later, four-wheel drives replaced pack animals, but the responsibility remained the same. They searched for broken wire, fresh animal tracks, damaged gates, flood washouts, anything that might allow wild dogs to cross into protected sheep country. Their work was rarely dramatic. Most days were spent travelling hundreds of kilometres through heat, dust, and silence, repairing damage long before most Australians even knew it existed. Even today, that work continues. The dog fence is still inspected on a regular basis. Major sections have been rebuilt using stronger materials. Modern patrol teams use GPS, digital reporting systems, and aerial inspections, but the principle has changed very little. The fence still depends on people willing to maintain it, section by section, kilometre by kilometre. Perhaps that is the most remarkable part of its story. Australia did not simply build one of the world's longest fences. Generation after generation, Australians chose to maintain it. So, did it work? The short answer is yes, but not on its own. Measured against its original purpose, the dog fence achieved something remarkable. Measured against its original purpose, the dog fence achieved something remarkable. For generations, it helped reduce the movement of wild dogs into some of Australia's most important sheep-producing regions. Combined with patrols, baiting programs, and ongoing maintenance, it became one part of a broader strategy to protect the pastoral economy that shaped much of inland Australia. But history rarely ends with a single answer. As the decades passed, a different question began to emerge. What happens when people reshape a landscape to solve one problem? Modern ecological research has shown that dingoes are more than livestock predators. As Australia's largest terrestrial predator, they also play an important role in many ecosystems. In some regions, researchers argue that reducing dingo populations can influence ecological balance, affecting other predators, herbivores, and native wildlife. At the same time, many pastoralists continue to regard wild dogs as a serious threat to livestock and rural livelihoods. These perspectives do not always agree, yet both are part of Australia's story. The dog fence was never simply about wire stretching across the outback. It came to represent two enduring priorities. On one side stood the need to protect a pastoral economy that supported millions of sheep. On the other stood an ecosystem that had evolved over thousands of years. More than a century later, Australia is still navigating that balance, not because the questions have disappeared, but because the answers remain complex. More than a century has passed since Australians first began building a barrier across the outback. Generations have come and gone. Governments have changed. The sheep industry has evolved. Scientific understanding has advanced. Yet the fence remains. Not exactly as it once was, but as each generation has repaired, rebuilt, and redefined it. Few Australians will ever stand beside the dog fence. Fewer still will follow it across the vast landscapes it helps protect. Yet its story reaches far beyond the wire itself. It is the story of a young nation striving to build prosperity in one of the world's harshest environments.
A story of ambition, adaptation, engineering, and the difficult choices that continue to shape Australia's relationship with its land. Perhaps that is why the dog fence still matters, not simply because it is one of the world's longest fences,
but because it reminds us that every great engineering project leaves more than a physical mark on the landscape. It leaves a legacy, and sometimes it leaves questions that every generation must answer for itself. Thank you for watching Beneath Australia. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe and join us as we uncover Australia's forgotten places, hidden history, and remarkable stories. Because every place has a story, we find the ones quietly disappearing.